Welcome to the Portland chapter gathering of Reasons to Believe, November 19th, 2022. We are a science and faith organization. We strive to engage in positive conversations with knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. As a chapter of RTB, we make every effort to help people discover that sound reason and scientific research consistently affirm the truth of the Bible and the good news it reveals. A few announcements, actually just one major one, is I want you all to save the date, and this is also a call to action. RTB Portland chapter, along with the George Fox University Apologetics Initiative, RTB headquarters, Ratio Christi Western Region, Apologetics on Mission, Confident Christianity, are excited to announce Resonate 2023, Why the Christian Story Resonates with Humanity. The dates are February 17th and 18th, 2023, and it will be at George Fox University. Derry sang, and she described it so well, and so I'm going to quote her, and she's here on the call as well. God's design for us and our core longings as human beings are an intimate connection with our Creator and with each other. The Christian story is the one story that exemplifies our deepest longings, and it is historically true. Our longing for this true story is reflected in the movies, songs, poems, stories, and art that we create. These creations resonate deeply within us because they bear witness to an underlying reality. So for this conference, our musician artist is John Guerrera, and our speakers are Mary Jo Sharp of Confident Christianity, Greg Gansel, professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, our very own current president of RTB, Fuz Rana. And Fuz is also an elder for his church. So on the Sunday, February 19th, we're also working to see if he would be able to do a sermon at a local church nearby. So please reserve these dates for Resonate 2023, Why the Christian Story Resonates with Humanity. Also, please consider how you might be able to contribute to our efforts. And if you come up with something, please email me at rtb.portland.or@gmail.com. Okay, following this presentation, we will have an interactive Q&A. All right, now for the reason that we're here today. In our summer series, An Apologetic for Our Secular Age, Dr. Paul Lorenzini established that Orthodox Christianity is under assault from two directions: the legacies of Enlightenment and the spirit of Romanticism. Building on that cultural model, Dr. Lorenzini will demonstrate how C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man can be integrated into a modern cultural model of the three selves and serve as a framework for an apologetic approach to the tensions between these three selves. I am honored to reintroduce our guest and speaker, Dr. Paul Lorenzini. He graduated from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, earned a PhD in nuclear engineering from Oregon State University. He also earned a law degree from Loyola Law School. He is an RTB visiting scholar, a writer, a philosopher, a nuclear engineer, an energy consultant, a co-founder of NewScale Power. He was also inducted into the Oregon State University Engineering Hall of Fame. He's active in Caro's Prison Ministry International. He has served as a trustee of the Oregon State University Foundation Board, currently serves on the OSU Board of Regents for the Honors College, and he has taught on how history influenced and shaped America's Thoughts and Behavior, and on Being a Christian in the 21st Century as a colloquium at OSU Honors College in 2020 and a course at George Fox University in 2021. Dr. Paul Lorenzini, welcome and thank you again for joining us virtually here in Portland, Oregon.
Well, thank you, Belinda, and thank you for all that you did to get me ready for this opportunity. C.S. Lewis and the Three Selves, let me just start with, if I can get my thing to work here. Oh, great. There we go. So let me start with this three noble cultural framework, the sort of the background that I developed in the earlier two sessions. And as Belinda mentioned, the idea here is that we can understand modern American culture and modern culture in the West, frankly, as a tension between three different ways of looking at the world. There's the Orthodox Christian worldview that we hold. There's a materialistic science worldview that comes out of the Enlightenment. And there's what I've called a spirit of Romanticism, but it's a sort of category of all kinds of ways of looking at the world, which have in common a turn to what we call the subjective self. It's focused internally. So if you look at that model, what we developed in the last two sessions was the idea that Orthodox Christianity can be understood as being under assault from both of those sides and in different ways. And from the Enlightenment side, the view is transcendence doesn't make any sense. We live in a materialistic world, and science shows us that Christianity is false. From the Romantic side, it's a different way of looking at it. They will acknowledge that we live in a world of spirituality, but they'll deny that there is a unique spiritual truth. And so their attack against Christianity will be based on the notion that Christians believe that there is a singular, universal, true being, which they find offensive, they find it rigid, they find it intolerant. And so you get these two different kinds of attacks. And we talked about how those attacks differ and what's an appropriate response to that. What I'd like to do is shift the focus a little bit. We think about that often in terms of beliefs. But I'd like to turn that around and suggest that we think about it in terms of three selves, because ultimately our beliefs shape our self-identity, and it's our self-identity that motivates us, and it's our self-identity that sort of drives us to do what we do. And as before, I'm going to rely heavily on this book by Charles Taylor, 800-page book, 2007, A Secular Age. It's sort of anchored a lot of what I do. I've relied a lot on Francis Schaeffer and other people, but he's anchored it. So I'll make a lot of references to Charles Taylor. And if you recall the sessions that we had last summer, Charles Taylor, one of his important insights was the notion that when we look at the Enlightenment and when we look at the way Enlightenment thought developed, we tend to think of it as science pushed out religion because it showed that religion just didn't hold up to rational scrutiny. Taylor turns that around and he says, actually, that's not the right model. The right model is that we were motivated by a new sense of self that came out of a discovery that we were powerful as individuals, that we no longer needed God, that we no longer needed religion. With Descartes, we were able to separate the mind from the cosmos. We were an independent self. And so it's very, that self is very externally focused. How do we acquire knowledge of the world around us? It's skeptical of feelings and emotions. Let's not let our emotions take control of us. But most important, it's empowered. It's autonomous. It says, I am a powerful self. It's filled with pride. I no longer need and I no longer want a transcendent God. So compare that to this Romantic view, which arose as a response to this Enlightenment view, this materialistic view. And because that was seen as dehumanizing, that dehumanizing aspect of the Enlightenment paved the way for a new way of looking at the self. So the self of the Romantic period is inwardly focused. And people talk about a massive subjective turn. it seeks to fill this emotional void that was left by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment said we aren't fully human, we can't be fully human, we're basically these mechanical selves. And the Romantic self said, no, that can't possibly be true. We are full, we're rich, we have feelings, we have emotions, we have intuition. And it's skeptical of religion and science, which tend to say that's not the case. It's spiritual, as I said before, but it denies an external universal truth. And so in that sense, it embraces spiritual pluralism. So what it says is, to the extent that we claim to have values and morals, they're personal, they're self-created. So both of these, of course, are distinct from the Christian worldview, which is external and internal. And I think of this almost in Augustinian sense. Internally, we probe our inner depths and face this struggle we have between doing what's right and the forces of evil, and we struggle with that tension. But it also drives us to look externally to the power of an external God that we believe to be universally true. And it's through God's grace that we are able to experience moral healing for that struggle that we all feel. So if you think about it in those three terms, you wind up with this sort of diagram. And if you notice at the bottom, it argues that Romanticism and this sort of Enlightenment thought, they're not only in tension with Christianity, they're in tension with each other. And that's a kind of a counterintuitive thing. We don't normally think of ourselves as not able to reconcile our scientific side and our emotional side. And what this is suggesting is that something happened as these modes of thought developed that caused them to be divided, that caused them to be separated, that made it very difficult to reconcile the differences between them. And so the differences, ultimately, the Enlightenment self reflects this inner self. It emphasizes the mind. The Romantic self emphasizes feelings and emotions. And people have seen this tension. Richard Tarnas, who wrote this book, The Passions of the Western Mind, described it as an intractable division between the mind and the soul. Simon Critchley, who I referred to in the last session, called it an intractable dilemma. It's not just a dilemma, it's a dilemma that is intractable. No way to resolve it within the framework of these two worldviews. And it's a dilemma, obviously, because we can't be fully human unless we bring those two sides of ourselves together. For Francis Schaeffer, it anchored his apologetic. So what Francis Schaeffer did is he looked back at this period and he said, we came out of this period with a divided self. We can't live as a divided self. That leads to despair. He talks about crossing the line of despair when we discovered this. And his answer is that Christianity resolves this and unifies the divided self. So that was the center of his apologetic. The problem is it's been a hard sell. People, it was thrown in our face when C.P. Snow delivered his lecture on the two cultures. Everybody talked about it, but nobody was willing to go this far. Well, it's just a matter of educating scientists to be sensitive to the arts. You saw, Tarnas and Critchley and others identified it, but they were sort of a subculture off to the side. Nobody paid a lot of attention to them, and they had no coherent resolution for how to bring these two together. Francis Schaeffer had his apologetic, but if you try to use that apologetic, you don't get very far. I mean, you sit down with somebody and say, well, do you ever struggle with the idea that your scientific self and your Romantic self have this difficulty reconciling each other? People sort of eyes glaze over and they'll say, no. I mean, it's not something people relate to, which suggests that it's there, but we aren't really aware of it. It's sort of obscured by the way we live our lives. And people who advocate the Enlightenment, they just sort of blow it off. Well, that's just the Romantics. They're a little crazy anyway. So Charles Taylor has a hint at what happened that caused this new way of looking at these two worldviews to develop. And he says that in our secular age, what came out of the Enlightenment and what came out of this Romantic period are two worldviews that are defined by what he called exclusive humanism. Now, I don't remember if I spent much time on that before. I'm going to spend time on it today. Exclusive humanism is a humanism that is committed to human flourishing and beneficence. So it has a moral standard, and yet it denies any allegiance to external sacred orders. So that's key. So if you look at this, he argues what makes this so different. Humanism has got a history in the West. There are lots of forms of humanism as you go back through Western history over the last 2,000 years, but they were non-exclusive forms of humanism. In every case, they had higher beings like gods, just a quote, higher beings like, whatever, that demanded and deserved our awe, our reverence, our devotion. And in some sense, they had authority over us. What makes exclusive humanism different is that it rejects the idea that there are any sacred orders that have any authority over us, that we owe any allegiance to. And so if you take those two thoughts and you put them together, and you go back to this three nodal model, on the one hand, you can see that it's got three different ways of looking at the world, three different selves that look at the world in different ways, and so they feel a tension between themselves. And yet, if you look at this bottom two selves, the Enlightenment and the Romantic selves, they have something in common that separates them from the Christian self. The Christian self is committed to external sacred orders, to God, to the infinite God of the universe. The Enlightenment self and the Romantic self, they fall in this category of exclusive humanism, and they show no allegiance to sacred orders. So if you just take that picture and you say to yourself, okay, what do I do with that? How does that help me understand our modern world? And so enter C.S. Lewis. Now, I'm referring here to C.S. Lewis's book about Abolition of Man. I expect many of you know about this book, but I think among most Christians, when you say C.S. Lewis, not many will point to the Abolition of Man. I think of Mere Christianity, his book on miracles. He's much less known for this book, Abolition of Man. So along my journey, Joseph Clare, George Fox told me I should read C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. And I read it, and I don't know how many of you have read it. And I have to say that I wasn't smart enough to get the message. I found it very difficult, and I walked away thinking, yeah, I got it, so what's the big deal? It didn't really resonate with me. And then recently, Michael Ward came out with this book. He's a Brit. Came out with this book, A Guide to the Abolition of Man, I think 2020, 2021. And I saw the book and I got it and I started reading it. And all of a sudden it was like, whoa, I'm starting to get it. I'm starting to get the picture. But what really happened for me is Joseph Clare at George Fox had a podcast interview with Michael Ward, about an hour. And I have to say, it was an epiphany for me. It kind of blew me away when I really realized what C.S. Lewis was saying to us and how that related to this work that I'd been doing, this thinking that I'd been having. So I want to share with you is why it affected me that way. Now, just in terms of the book itself, Michael Ward alerts us to the fact that this is different from his other books. His other books are Christian apologetic books. This is a book on philosophy. And because of that, it's had a wide audience, and he talks about philosophers, educators, and so forth. So it's widely recognized in an audience that's much bigger than the Christian community. But these were the two things that impressed me. Ranked number 7 by the National Review in its list of top 100 nonfiction books of the 20th century, number 2 by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So somebody thinks this is a really, really important book for us to understand. So Michael Ward gives us context, and it relates to this tension between these two selves. He tells us that in his early years, C.S. Lewis struggled with his sort of romantic side. He was a romantic. He wrote these books, Tales of Narnia and so forth. He had these romantic impulses, and yet he would come home and reflect on those romantic impulses and his rational side. And he was sensitive enough and reflective enough to realize that there was something about those two impulses that didn't match, that there was a tension between them, and he wanted to understand what it was. And he really got interested in it because during the 1940s, this school of positivism began to develop, and that was having an additional influence, driving people in the sciences to reject any sense that the feelings and the emotions have any objective value at all. And he felt that that was wrong. So he wrote this book to deal with that. The book is broken up into 3 major chapters: Men Without Chests, and let's just kind of overlook the political incorrectness of that. I'm just going to go with it. The Way, and the Abolition of Man. So if you take chapter 1, Men Without Chests, he starts by using this book, and he doesn't want to embarrass these guys. These 2 English authors wrote a book for kids on education and on how to study the. We got another one on education, and he doesn't even tell you the name of the book. He calls it the Green Book. But what he does is he takes from the Green Book, Gaius and Titius, he calls them, Their claim at one point that feelings are private, purely subjective, they can't be true. He uses as an example, we're looking at a waterfall. Somebody says the waterfall is beautiful, and Gaius and Titius say, well, you might feel that, but that's just how you feel. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's any truth out there that says the waterfall is beautiful. Well, C.S. Lewis doesn't like that. And so he looks at that and he says, this poses a question. These are Lewis's words. Does what we say about things correspond to how they really are, or does it not? Are feelings about external matters nothing more than private emotions, or can they be true? Not just true for ourselves, but true objectively. And one of the examples that Michael Ward uses is an example that comes from A.J. Ayer, who is expressing his view of positivism. And he's got this little vignette. He says, if I say to somebody, you were wrong in stealing that money, I'm not saying anything more than if I had said you stole that money. In adding that this action is wrong and making any further statement about it simply evinces my moral unhappiness with it. And so what he's saying is, if somebody steals something and I look at that and I say, that's wrong, well, that's just how I feel. I can't impose my feelings on somebody else. You don't have to feel that way. You can look at that and say it's not wrong. There's no objective standard out there for us to look to. All we have is ourselves and our feelings have no meaning beyond what we just happen to feel. Well, C.S. Lewis says, no, that can't be true. And so what he does is he looks to the history of humanity, cultures, back to the Egyptians, the Greeks, all these different world cultures. And what he observes is that in all of them, there's awareness of morality. There's an awareness of objective truth. And he calls this the Tao, actually. And Michael Ward is clever here. He says he kind of backfoots us because you sort of expect him to say it's going to be Christianity. And he doesn't do that. He uses this concept of a Tao as a generalized idea that there is an objective moral truth out there that all humans have understood throughout history. And later he'll get to the point of saying, if that truth exists, it must point to Christianity. But for the purpose of this book, he calls it the Tao. And he says what's common to all of them is something that you can't neglect. It's the doctrine of, and I got to find a way to get you guys, it's the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and other attitudes are false. And so he gives these at the back of his book. He goes through several pages of these historical cultures and shows how much they have in common with each other. He's got 9 different categories. This is a list of it, but the point here is that throughout all of them, there are moral standards that are common to every society in human history. They all have these. So he's arguing that this suggests that there is a moral truth out there, and he wants to call it the Tao, but there's a moral truth out there, and it's a moral truth that we need to acknowledge, and we need to show that it legitimizes the idea that these truths are objective. Without the Tao, he argues, if we don't acknowledge those truths, we become less than human. And so Gaius and Titius have debunked the Tao as mere feelings. They have no objective value. And so then he says, okay, what happens when you do that? Well, you have no basis for aspiring to virtue or valor or justice. You can do it because you feel that that's what you should do, but you don't have any basis for saying to your children, for example, you should do this. We have no basis for doing that, even though we all know that we do aspire to it. There's a missing link. And he uses this metaphor. And the metaphor is head, belly, chest. And he says the reason this happens is because we've disconnected the head, where we do all of our thinking, our mind games, from the belly, where we feel things, where we have our emotional center. And as a result of disconnecting the head from the belly, we become a mere intellectual spirit. We become less than human. And so his word for that is we become men without chests. Because to be fully human, we have to have a way to integrate our head with our belly. The chest is the source of that integration. We might pay attention to our appetites, but we can't let our appetites rule either, because they must be controlled by reason. So the head balances the appetites inform the head. The head rules the belly through the chest, And the chest is an indispensable liaison. It's between the cerebral man and the visceral man, the belly. So the chest ties the two together. And when the chest enters the picture, the chest allows us to become fully human. But in order to have a chest, we have to acknowledge the Tao. And so he concludes in the Green Book that denying the Tao produces men without chests. So let's go back now and look at this three nodal framework. And what he's really, if you put that chest belly Tao in the picture, you can think of the Tao as a generalized expression of Orthodox Christianity, which is in conflict with the head, because the head denies its allegiance to these external orders. The belly, which also denies its allegiance to these external orders. And so he says what you need between the head and the belly is the chest to bring the two together. The chest will integrate the whole person, but it requires the Tao in order to do that. So he lays this foundation in chapter 2, and so in chapter 1. So in chapter 2, he then says, okay, let's talk about what happens when you do that. And so he calls it the way, and he introduces a fictional character. He calls him the innovator. And the innovator's job is to say, okay, I have now rejected the Tao. I've now rejected any allegiance to external orders, but I'm still going to try to create values, because we all know that values are central to the way we live our lives. We all have to have them. So how am I going to create these values if I don't have a Tao? And so he works through the logic of what the innovator is thinking about. And he notes that the innovator makes two major discoveries. The first is empirical facts don't lead to values. You can't go from facts to values. Now, this is the famous David Hume is ought conundrum. I've got facts. I can't draw any conclusion about values from the facts. For facts to lead to values, one must have objective moral standards, which can be applied in order to create values. You have to have values that can be applied. You have to have moral standards that can be applied to the facts in order to get to values. So I'm going to use this example to illustrate that point. If you do a Google search on IRAC, just do that search, you're going to come up with all kinds of links, because there's this formula, this outline that every law school student is taught from the very first day of law school, that when you answer an exam in law school, you have to start with the issue, you look to the rule, you apply the rule to the facts, and you come to a conclusion. And it looks like this. And if you read any legal opinion, it will follow this outline. It begins with the facts. The facts tell us, and if you get a law school exam, all you'll get is about a full page statement of facts, and then it will say, come to these conclusions. Tell me what's right or wrong. Well, you start with these facts, and you have to say, okay, what issues are posed by those facts? And then what rule do I apply? And then I apply my reason. Once I've said I know what the rule is, I apply my reason to show how the rule relates to the facts. And only then can I come to a conclusion. Well, what happens if you don't have the rule? If you don't have the rule, reason has nothing to use to go from the facts to the values. It has to, reason alone cannot create values. And so reason can't create the moral standard on its own. It can only discover it. So here's an example of what that leads to. Now, this, you may remember the Nuremberg war trials. These Nazis had committed this horrible genocide. They were all gathered together, and everybody knew we wanted to hang them. But how do you do that? What's your justification? And they struggled with the standard. And they couldn't just use reason. Nobody was going to sit in a corner and say, let me see, 1 + 1 equals crimes against humanity. Well, that doesn't really work. And so what did they do? They had to actually think their way through, where are we going to find these moral standards? And they found them in an analogy of what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao. They found them in human history. And they found them by looking to human history and saying, no matter where you go, we all know that killing other people and committing genocides is morally wrong. And because we can take that rule, and because we can apply that rule, we can justify a trial where we find these men guilty and hang them. But they had to find the rule, and they discovered it through reason. They didn't create it through reason. So the other part of this is the standard has to be objective if it's to be universal. I can't just say, I can't look at these guys and say, well, you guys did something wrong and I feel like it's wrong, and therefore I'm going to hang you. Well, if I do that, I'm just saying my moral standards matter more than your moral standards. I have to be able to say that my moral standards are objective and universally true, and that together we can all acknowledge that I'm not applying them because I feel this way. I'm applying them because this is a universal, objectively true moral standard. So, okay, so the innovator runs into this roadblock, and C.S. Lewis says, okay, well, what happens next? He makes a second discovery. He says, okay, if reason isn't going to work, let me try instinct. Instinct inherited through evolution. Well, that doesn't work either. Lewis points out, when you think of instinct, all you have are a set of impulses, and they're often conflicting impulses. The reflective human has to choose which impulses to indulge and which impulses to control. And reason isn't enough. There has to be some standard that he uses, that the person uses, in order to make that choice. And so without an external moral standard, there is no basis for us to choose between these conflicting impulses and come up with morals. And so reflecting without the Tao is not enough. And so he comes to this conclusion that the innovator has been backed into a corner. And this is a quote. He says, the truth finally becomes apparent that neither in any operation with factual propositions, the first part, nor in any appeal to instinct, the second part, can the innovator find the basis for a system of values. And so he then concludes that without the Tao, we become trousered apes. Now, I know this is a dog, it's not an ape, but you get the picture. If all we have are instincts, we are no more than sophisticated animals dressed up to look like humans, but we're really nothing more than sophisticated animals. So the whole idea of men without chest is we're left in this sort of condition where we don't have any basis for moral standards. So now let's go back to this picture that we started with, where we came out of the secular society, and say, how does this make any sense for us? And how do we use this in a way that adds some content to this picture of the secular society that shows that we've got these three views. We've got a Christian self that's committed to external standards, and we've got these other two views that reject external sacred orders. They reject the Tao. Well, what it tells us is exclusive humanism has a problem. It claims to embrace morals, human flourishing and beneficence, but it rejects external orders. And so if you're going to find morals, if you're going to find these morals of human flourishing and benevolence, you have to have a basis for doing it. So how do we find a basis for embracing human flourishing and benevolence if we reject these external orders, which is what exclusive humanism does? So Charles Taylor, interestingly, if you step back and look at what he does, he in effect takes on the role of the innovator. He says, how do I do this? And so he goes through an analysis of how you get to this in a world where exclusive humanism is the dominant mode of thinking. So the task of Lewis's innovator, just to recall, was to figure out how to create values once the Tao has been rejected. And this is a quote from Taylor. He says, at this point, he says, moral sources had to be created and discovered. And if they were going to be created and discovered without the Tao, they had to be found within humans. And interestingly, he makes the point that exclusive humanism has a moral standard that isn't just any moral standard. If you look back through humanism in history, humanism tended to talk to peace among ourselves, but it wasn't activist and interventionist. Moral human flourishing and moral benevolence, as we think of it today, is an outreach. It means we seek the good of all people. We reach out to all people. Earlier forms of humanism didn't do that. So we not only have to figure out how we came up with this moral standard of human benevolence and human flourishing, we have to figure out how it got to the point that it was this activist and interventionist mode of a moral standard. There's no historical form of humanism that claims that kind of stance. So guess what? It could be found in the historical trace of Christian agape. This is a quote. We find it in the historical trace of Christian agape. What's that mean? It means that for a couple thousand years, Christian agape had been adopted into the culture. It had been embraced. It was the way we thought. And so, okay, let's say that we no longer need God's grace in order to achieve Christian agape. We still know that we have it. And so the notion of agape sort of hung on to it and hung on to this notion that we could achieve this higher good, but we decided we could do it without God. And so what does that mean? This is the only place that we find this stance is in this historical trace of agape. And then he comes to this conclusion: it would probably not have been possible to make the transition to exclusive humanism on any other basis. So not only does exclusive humanism come up with this moral standard, not only does it borrow in order to have that moral standard from Christian agape, he goes farther and says, without Christian agape, we could have never created this moral standard that exclusive humanists claim to have. But there's still a problem. How do you then find a source for agape if it doesn't come from Christianity? So Taylor goes through this analysis. He says, well, there's something in us that drives us in that direction. We're endowed with a specific bent. And he throws words out like will and sympathy and dignity. These are all characteristics of how we are as humans. But he never really asks the question, if that's how we are as humans, why are we that way? What accounts for this bent, which is both universal in all humans and unique to humans among the entire creation? He never asks that question, and he never answers that question. What's this say at the top? So what does he conclude? He basically says, well, it all arrives out of reason. Reason gets us there. Any reasonable person feels this way. And so he brings Montesquieu in to support this idea and has this statement: if living up to my dignity as a rational human being involves acting for universal beneficence and justice, then a bent toward these must be part of what a rationality requires, part of what a rational age finds within herself as a defining feature. So we can just get there. We don't need to have a rule to get there. Reason gets us there. And yet C.S. Lewis has shown pretty clearly reason can't get you there unless you acknowledge this notion that something within us drives us there. And if you don't acknowledge that something within us, and if you don't show how that something within us has a source, that isn't sourced because we happen to be reasonable people. I mean, frankly, if all you have is reason, you're where Hermann Goering was. At these Nuremberg trials, Hermann Goering used reason to argue that genocide made total sense because there was no standard. You have to have a moral standard, and reason doesn't supply it for you. So, two problems with this. First, as Lewis argued, reason doesn't give us morals. It can only discover morals. Second, if the source of morals is within us, it's subjective. They can't be universal because I can't say my morals apply to you. There has to be some objective outer source for those morals. So to be universal, to be objective, morals must have a reference point that is outside ourselves, that's external. So in other words, to find moral sources for exclusive humanism, if you summarize what Taylor did, well, he claimed we have an agape analog, that's what he called it, by inheritance. So he just borrows from Christianity. He claimed it can be sourced without God by pointing to some kind of universal bent that we have without explaining the source of that universal bent. And he claimed one does not discover this because one can create it through human reason. Now, those of you familiar with Nietzsche will recognize in this one of Nietzsche's complaints about the Enlightenment and what happened, because he observes this, he makes this point, and he's highly critical of Enlightenment thinkers for borrowing from Christian morals without facing up to the reality that that's what they've done. And it's sort of remarkable that a thinker of Charles Taylor's status would go through this argument and not realize that that's what he's doing. And I sort of feel a little pretentious, like this little pipsqueak from Portland, Oregon, saying, well, Charles Taylor, you missed something. So I'm going to just let this stand and you draw your own conclusions. But that's how it seems to me. So C.S. Lewis counters. He says, well, there is a universal bent, but to find that universal bent, we can observe it through the Tao, and reason can't create it. It has to be found within. And by the way, that was Nietzsche's answer. Nietzsche's answer was we look within ourselves and we create our own values. Well, so how does this translate then into the culture? And so I'd like to take it as a case in point, Michael Shermer. Now, Michael Shermer is interesting to me because I'd never heard of him. He gave a presentation in Portland that I was invited to sit in on. And he's got this book that he wrote, The Moral Arc, How Science Makes Us Better People. And he goes through a really strong case to show that in the last 200 years, we have progressed on a number of moral fronts. And he attributes it to reason. He attributes it to we become a more rational person. And there's a lot of truth to that. We have become more rational as we've gotten rid of superstition and myth. But what that means, I believe, is that our rationality has connected us with these moral sources. And he just wants to simply say there are no moral sources. We're seeing this moral arc that is grounded in this moral purpose, which he says we have. And so what he does is he repeats the problem of the innovator. He says we get it through instinct. The moral purpose of human flourishing and beneficence is derived from human reason plus evolution. So he never confronts the problem that instincts doesn't get you there. And meanwhile, while doing this, he rages at Christianity, which has an external sacred order. He hates Christianity. And he's got this one passage that if God really believes in equal rights for all people, one would think that he would have said something about them in his holy book. But such sentiments are nowhere to be found. Now, in our monthly scholar call, I raised Michael Shermer, and I actually raised this passage, and Hugh Ross stepped in and he said, I've debated Shermer 4 times, and he is fundamentally ignorant about what the Bible says. And so one of the passages that he referred to that I kind of got like dumped on by everybody in the group, aren't you familiar with Galatians 3:26-28? Well, what does that say? For you are all sons of God, for you are all baptized into Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male or female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ. We all have equal dignity before God. Now, Belinda pointed out that this seems to suggest that this is only true for Christians, but I don't think you can read the entire scripture as a whole and not believe that God is telling us that every individual human being has equal dignity in his eyes. So notice something else. When Shermer has this passage, he says you don't find anything about human rights in the Bible. What you do find is a lot of talk about obligations. The Bible isn't concerned as much about the rights that society owes us as it is about what we owe others. And so the second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 25 speaks of all the expectations Jesus has on us to give to other people, to pay attention to other people's concerns. You don't find very much in there about what society owes me as a matter of rights that I have. And interestingly, if you look at the Tao and you start working your way through all 9 of these rules, you see the same thing. The Tao is focused on obligations and duties that we owe to others. So what's the takeaway? I walk away from Shermer and I have to tell you that my initial takeaway was, oh my gosh, he's made an argument. What is the proper response to that? Well, the first thing we can say is, yes, there has been moral progress. By eliminating superstition and myth, we've used our reason, we've uncovered these truths, but it only happened because reason discovered the Tao, not because it created the Tao. And by relying on evolution, Schumer only highlights the problem because, as Lewis said, evolution only gives us instincts, it doesn't give us morals. And furthermore, his attack on Christianity obscures the need for external moral sources. He's basically not only saying we don't need external moral sources, he's saying we don't need it squared because let's get rid of Christianity. In fact, he argues that Christianity has been the source of morals in the West, and the response is that Christianity has been the source of morals in the West, including agape, and without Christianity, Shermer's stuck looking inward. And this gets back to a point that I made in the last session. One of the things that we as Christians need to do a better job of understanding is how Christianity historically has been a universal good for humanity. And Ken Samples does a really good job of that in his book on, I forget the title, but I mentioned it last time. And then finally, this emphasis on personal rights versus obligation, there's a subtlety there. This really defines where our society has gone. And one of the things that's happened, and this gets into the notion of what this does to society, we've shifted from aspirational values, truth and beauty and goodness, to an internal emphasis on the self, to what society owes me in the form of my rights. And so that the conversation now is about race and gender and class, divisive concepts that are basically grounded in, I want to assert my rights, I have certain rights, and I want society to respect them. And it reminds me of that famous passage in John Kennedy's inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, ask instead what you can do for your country. We sort of lost that sort of thread. So chapter 3 gets into the abolition of man. Where does it leave us we have now done this? We've created men without chests. And so he gives us a diagnosis, and then he offers a prognosis. He says, without the moral anchor of a Tao, society and future generations are at the personal whim of leaders who are bound only to themselves. They don't have any objective standards. Their standards are subjective. So they can basically say, once they get into a leadership position, this is what I think. And because I have power over you, I can impose this on you, even though I have no external standard for being able to say that I have a right to impose it on you. So I want to go back to something that I discussed in the earlier sessions. How does this relate to America and the American culture? I have focused a lot on the 60s because I believe the 60s was a turning point in the American culture. And this is a pictorial description of that. The idea here is that if you look at pre-60s America, there was a strong emphasis on science, but Christianity sort of held the mainstream in so many different ways without necessarily getting into denominational differences. It was a central value in our culture. This whole idea of Romanticism, it was there, but it was sort of marginalized. If you go through that short 10-year period and you look at post-60s America, something fundamental happened. In the first place, our commitment to Christianity was marginalized. And in the past 4 decades, we've seen that happen. We've seen the rise of the nuns. We've seen spiritual but not religious. And in its place, Romanticism was normalized, this idea where everything revolves around the self. And so what I'm suggesting here is we became men without chests as a culture during the 60s when we marginalized Christianity and we normalized Romanticism. And so there's lots of data here, lots of indicators of this. One of the famous ones is right in the wake of the 60s, Tom Wolfe comes out with this famous article in New York Magazine, The Me Generation, capturing this whole idea that things have suddenly turned inward. The new alchemical dream was changing one's personality, remaking, remodeling, elevating, and polishing one's very self, and observing, studying, and doting on it, doting on me. And he's a very great writer, and he talks about how everybody loved this because I could go to a conference and now we're talking about me, and so there's this sudden turn to making myself the center of everything. And there are all kinds of studies that sort of alluded to this. Daniel Yankelovich writes in 1971 that one of the most remarkable legacies of the 60s was a common search for self-fulfillment. Robert Bella in 1985 with colleagues at the University of California, Habits of the Heart, the most defining mark in post-60s culture was this emphasis on expressive individualism. Charles Taylor writes a book in 1991 called The Ethics of Authenticity. Somewhere between this whole idea of looking within the self for self-fulfillment, psychological man, if you want to call it that, expressive individualism, it's up to me to decide who I am and be expressive about it. The ethics of authenticity, what's most important in society is for me to be an authentically true self. All of that is coupled from our standpoint as Christians with a burst of new spirituality that emphasized the personal spiritual experience, from New Age to Joseph Taylor to spiritual but not religious. And we talked about a lot of that in the second of the sessions that we went through last summer. Well, more recently, Carl Trueman has come out with this book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, 2021, and he's captured just how far we've come and has a whole book on the significance of what it means for us to have become so focused on the self. And A, I don't have time, and B, it would be a session all its own to go through what he talks about in that book, but it's a book I highly recommend. The conclusion: with the era of Romanticism, a new understanding, so Romanticism was the key, a new understanding of human selfhood emerged. So it's all about the self, one focused on the inner life of the individual. And so he develops this whole idea of how Romanticism has changed it. And he talks about the importance of having severed ties to external sacred orders. We're on our own as selves. So the norm has become psychological man, focused on this quest for personal happiness, and therapy. Therapy is now focused on, used to be, I live in society, I'm struggling. How do I change my life so I can conform to the expectations of society? Now therapy is about how can I demand that society conform to me? Society can create safe spaces for me. Society needs to do all of these things to protect my own sense of psychological welfare. And then he introduces this idea, he gets it from somebody else by the name of Peter Reef, what he calls third world cultures. So this is intended to be a sort of historical trace. In the first world, you had pagans, they were rooted in pagan gods, external. In the second world, you had religions rooted in a transcendent God, Christianity. We have now transitioned to what he called a third world culture, where we are not rooted in external social orders. We don't acknowledge their moral imperative in anything sacred. They justify themselves on the basis of themselves. And so how does this relate to the abolition of man, where the ultimate prognosis? Because Lewis warns that to the extent we become this self-centered self and disconnect all of our connections to external sacred orders, a Tao to begin with, it becomes catastrophic for society. And what Trueman is now saying decades later, 80 years later, is that this is actually happening. The move to a third world culture is one of catastrophic cultural significance, leading to damaging cultural pathologies, rendering their cultures profoundly volatile, subject to confusion, and liable to collapse. When the self is the center, the result is moral chaos. And so his whole book is developing this thesis to show just how that's happened to us. So if you want to summarize, what we can see is that we live in a secular age. It's secular in the sense that it has rejected the Tao, and it's had consequences. And we can see warnings, even alarms, that stress the significance of the Christian message in our modern age. And so decades later, we can see the power of Lewis's Christian apologetic. Our experience points to a common human compulsion to follow objective moral standards, and they're always derived from some allegiance to an external sacred order. What Lewis calls the Tao, this larger moral intelligence, compels us. There's something in us that drives us to these moral standards, and he calls it the Tao. It's external to us, but it creates something within us. And then he gets to the next one. So what is this Tao? Well, whatever it is, it has to be personal. It needs to be moral, obviously. It needs to be infinite, so it's universal. It needs to be intelligent. It needs to be a being with agency, so it can act and be personal. And it needs to be universal. And so in Mere Christianity, interestingly, Tao graduates from the Abolition of Man to his Christian apologetic. And so the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity build on the Abolition of Man in his Christian apologetic. And if you go back and you reread the first 4 chapters, you'll see him referring back to the Abolition of Man. So that's where we are. And questions, comments, thoughts?
Thank you, Paul. If you would stop sharing your screen. Get everybody back on here. And just to remind everyone that we are recording the interactive Q&A. And if you would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand in the reactions tab, or you can just, speak up and bring out your question. And if you feel comfortable to go ahead and put on your video so we can see each other and have this conversation, that would be great. But you don't have to. All right. It looks like Doug has a question. Go ahead, Doug.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess a question and a comment. One of them is I just wanted to mention that the word Tao in Mandarin actually means way or footpath or road. So I'm not sure what sense C.S. Lewis is using it, but if he's thinking of it as some sort of force well, he probably needs to make sure he defines that, because that's probably not what it would mean in Mandarin. The other thing is,
if you notice, chapter 2 is called The Way.
okay, well, that would make sense. I need to read the book. But anyway, I just, that would make a lot of sense. And a lot of what you said would make more sense if you're understanding, and maybe I just wasn't quite getting it, but a lot of what you're saying makes more sense if you think about Tao as road or pathway, rather than some sort of, force, Star Wars like force or something.
I don't know that history as well as you do, or Eastern religion. I think I'm reading Lewis as taking liberties with it, if you will, and acknowledging that, using that word to associate it with this common moral history, call it the way. That's just how I'm reading Lewis.
Okay, great. I just also wanted to make a comment. As I'm listening to you speak, I'm just thinking about the fact that you're quite right about the need. Basically, you're raising the grounding issue for morals, and how we don't have a grounding anymore for anything. And I think that there's this hope, it seems, that everybody's just going to have different ideas of what's right, and then we're all going to play nicely together. But it doesn't work that way. We do have to have a common agreement on something, and the only way that gets settled now is by force. And I think that's the problem with relativism, or this idea that there is no grounding for truth. Everything is just is that it leads to an authoritarian situation. I think we're seeing that in our politics and in a lot of societal changes, that debate isn't really an issue anymore, because there is no such thing as an answer to that debate. Truth is decided by force, and I just think that's very disturbing and dangerous. So
Well,
I just
I'll
thought
just
I'd
say
mention
that's pretty insightful, because if you read the 3rd chapter, that's what he says. That's the conclusion that he comes to, is that we become a society where the leaders impose their own view on others, and since there is no external standard, they use the force of their power and their leadership to do it. So you're absolutely right on there.
I think we're seeing that today in our political discussion. End of comment.
Thank you, Doug. Ray, you have a question?
Yes, first I'd like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. It really was chock full of lots of wisdom and so on. I wondered if you were familiar at all with the work of Ian McGilchrist. He's a UK thinker, and he's worked more than 10 years, about 20 years, asking the question, or trying to answer the question, what does neuroscience teach us about some of the major things going on? And basically, the position is the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have different ways of viewing the world, different ways of attending to things, and that it can be used to explain many phenomena we see in our society today. And the problem is we have unbalanced thinking going on. And but ultimately, his last book, he says, this deep dive into neuroscience leads me to believe we have to recover the sacred. So in a sense, the thought process that he's going through ends up exactly where you ended up. And I just wondered if you were familiar with his work, and if not, maybe you want to give it a shot sometime.
I appreciate it. I'm not familiar with his name. I think, I don't know if you ever read Tom Wolfe's article. This is dated now, 1996. Sorry, but your soul just died, where he talks about how modern neuroscience is basically, through its materialism, concluded that consciousness is just an illusion. And from that, I have looked at other studies that have, there's a yin and a yang, if you will, by people who claim that neuroscience does answer all questions, and others who claim, as you know, the author you just mentioned does, that consciousness has to be real, and neuroscience on a materialistic basis doesn't get you there.
Jim, I see you unmuted. Do you have a question or comment?
Actually, I'm looking for a way to raise my hand and I can't find the little icon on here. But so thanks that you noticed. Again, I wanted to second what the previous speaker just mentioned. Ian McGilchrist has this 1,211 or 1,200 pages in 2 volumes, and it's really brilliant. But it's a whole big area of neuroscience and psychology and other things based on injuries to the brain and the reactions from that and the changes in thinking. And I won't take any more time. It's not what I wanted to raise my hand about anyway. What I wanted to raise it about was the idea of the, I think, certainty of objective moral values. I discovered the argument for that with Thomas Aquinas in his 5 arguments or proofs for the existence of God, one of which is the existence of objective moral values. And there are 4 others he also listed, like the contingent universe, the fact that there's order instead of chaos, and a couple of others, the fact that there's always movement in everything, what started the movement. Obviously, this is in the Summa that Thomas Aquinas wrote, but the question really is, are there not objective values, whether we agree with them or whether we're even aware of them or not? They exist separate from us. Paul, what's your thinking about that? Or have I missed something?
No, actually, and I think I commented on this when you said you were going to talk about Aquinas to the prisoners.
Right.
I think there's a strong parallel between what Lewis is arguing and the Aquinas proof. I think they're both coming at it from the same direction. So I agree with it, and I think that that's not very different from what Lewis is saying. He's just saying it in different words.
But I didn't hear him saying that it exists whether we agree with it or not. The fact is, we're still evolving. We may have another 500 or 1,000 years to go, or maybe 10 or 20. I don't know, but we may come to the point where we all agree again. And I think that would lead us directly towards Christianity if we did somehow find a way to agree that there is such a thing as objective moral values. Interestingly enough, I've noticed in my limited education that every time a authoritative government takes power, the first thing they go after is defining morality, defining what's right or wrong. And that's why the church is so often a serious target. They want to redefine what is right and what is allowable. Therefore, objective values becomes subjective. Your thoughts?
I agree. I think there's a kind of a dichotomy, if you will, between if we were in a group of people at a coffee chat and we talked about morals, I think everyone would agree that these are the right morals. I don't think you'd have any trouble getting people to say, right, yes, we should be looking out for other people.
But would they say that in China? Or would they speak softly?
I don't know. I guess I'm parochial and how I look at the world. but I do think. I mean, I use the example. My wife went to the funeral of Dan Wyden, kind of a really well-known guy in the area. Ad agency, did the Nike ads, and she came home a bubbling mess. And he had done he got this camp in Central Oregon for kids, needy kids, and all these people who had been helped by him came forward, talked about what he had done in their lives. And he's not a Christian. I don't think he professed to be a Christian. So how do you explain that? And how do you respond to people who look at that and say, well, you don't need to be a Christian to be good. Oh, and of course, they're right. You don't need to be a Christian to be good. What God's grace does for us is it elevates us and heals our own internal peace. But what I think the interpretation is that when you see somebody behaving that way, they're behaving in a way that is consistent, if I use the C.S. Lewis example, that is consistent with the way people have behaved in human societies throughout history. And it suggests that there's a reason for that. And so it calls upon us to ask the question, Why is that the case? And that allows us to begin to talk about what this force is, if it's God, and if it is God, what difference does that make for us?
Yeah. First, Gary, were you going to ask a question also? I see you unmuted.
I've been thinking about Romans chapter 1, and it was a good presentation, Paul, and I couldn't help but reflect back to a man by the name of Gene Roddenberry. Anybody recognize that name? Okay, I knew several of you would. He was a paramount figure in the belief in humanism. He was very, very strongly committed to humanism, and he's the guy who developed a program all of you will recognize called Star Trek, not Star Wars, Star Trek. It was a television series. I'd just be interested if you know what I'm talking about. Raise your hand. Okay, 2 or 3 of you. I would say the philosophy of Star Trek, which comes from Gene Roddenberry, is a very prominent way of thinking in the United States. And I've followed it for probably at least 40 years. And so I don't really have time to discuss it, but could I read Romans 1:18? For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because, now here's the key in verse 19, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And verse 21 is really the summary of this whole thing. It says, because although they knew God, and he's implying that that's everyone, that somewhere deep inside we know there's a God, but they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. We don't have time to discuss that, but if you go back and read that passage, it's the very first chapter of Romans, and some of the most profound theologians, like Karl Barth from Germany, wrote a whole series of commentaries on the book of Romans. And some of the things in Romans are more profound in this area, and it would take weeks for us to even discuss it. But I'm really feeling the key is most Christians, I think, believe that man is a triune being, spirit, soul, and body. I don't know if that's anybody has that feeling. Any comments? Dennis, you're smiling.
Well, thank you. Yeah, body, soul, and spirit, as far as I know. But yeah.
And so it's taking a little bit different direction, Paul. But humanism is a denial of the existence of God, I think, in its essence.
Yeah, so as I'm listening to you, number one, I'm reflecting, I'm very familiar with the Romans chapter 1 passage, and ultimately this whole conversation that we just had, relates back to what Paul says in that passage in Romans. So I think you're right to call our attention to that. I think the point that C.S. Lewis is making is if you acknowledge these truths as we've talked about, but you don't anchor them in some kind of accepted notion that A, they're objective, and B, they rely on some external source. We're free to go off in all kinds of different directions. And that's the problem. That's what we get into in our society, where there isn't anything to anchor our leaders. There isn't anything to anchor our social conversations. There isn't anything to anchor our practices around something that is external and objective. And so somebody might say, these are my standards. And we might all look at that and say, yes, that's really terrific. And we might look at a Dan Wyden and say how wonderful he lived his life. But if there isn't some anchor in society, society is going to drift and go off in a lot of dysfunctional directions. And that's the point that Carl Trueman is making, is that that's exactly what's happening, because we focus on ourself, and ourself has become the center rather than some external moral objective source. That's
Thank
my take on
you.
it anyway.
You.
Well, I think the Apostle Paul, were you going to say something, Dennis?
Well, I was just going to say, I'm the last few weeks I've been really aware of the result of this. There's just theft and everywhere. Even Target, their earnings statement is down because of theft. It's just rampant, and mental block here, but I'm just totally aware, almost in every direction, that that there's just dishonest. It's all about me, and rather than others. But it's just everywhere. And reading the news is same thing. It's just it's everywhere.
Right.
It's the byproduct of me, self. Exactly what you said.
Thank you, Dennis. Gary, do you have something more to say, or shall I?
Well, I was going to take it back to the denial of truth. I think one of the worst things that's happening in our culture is it's very difficult to find truth, and people have rationalized because they have no essence in their you know, the Apostle Paul actually teaches that you know, our spirit is dead unless we are reborn in Christ. So I'm just getting to basic Christian theology. And that's the problem that he's talking about in Romans chapter 1. Even though they knew inwardly that there's a God, they were not thankful and they did not worship him. And when we deny his presence and his existence, then everything's adrift. Truth goes away, morals go away. And now, as you mentioned, Dennis, theft is placated and not even punished in California. If your theft is $600 or less, you're not even brought into the court, and the chances are they won't arrest you and try to prosecute you. And you can see that's the denial of the essential. And we're going, I don't feel like we're going astray, but this is the center. Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I was going to say, just last week, I was at the checkout counter at Fred Meyer's, and there was somebody in front of me that had a cart full of stuff, and he paid just for a couple things, and he just pushed the cart out the door, and the cashier said that it happens all the time, and all they can do is just watch. They cannot chase the guy or anything. They just, all they can do is watch him walk out the door. And he had some other friends that were right by him, but they decided to go out another door. Well, they turned around and went another direction with their cart. And I kind of think that they were doing the same thing. You just, unless there's, you know, I think I could be wrong, but I think in Oregon, if it's like 900 or less, it's, you know, they don't get prosecuted, but it's just rampant.
Okay, guys, I'm going to move on because we have a few other people who want to ask questions and such. We can come back to that. We usually hang on afterwards, so you guys can continue the discussion. I see that I have Ray and then Chris, and then I think Derry might. Okay, and then I think I saw Jim. All right, so Ray, you first. Oh, yeah, there you go.
I just wanted to point out that in the Space Trilogy, the last book of the Space Trilogy called That Hideous Strength, C.S. Lewis in the forward or whatever to it that mentioned that he's making the points that he raised in Abolition of Man in that fictional form. And it's a wonderful read. I'm reading it right now with one of my grandsons. It describes so many things that are going on right today. And so if anybody, Abolition of Man is a very difficult book to get through. It's more fun to read Hideous Strength, I think, and you'll get a lot of the same ideas.
Thanks, Ray. Any comment, Paul, or?
Yeah, no, I think what's remarkable to me, at least as I went through this for me, was one, how hard it is to penetrate what he's really saying, but when you do, how rich it is. And the second is how prescient he was. He wrote this 80 years ago, and how currently significant it is for us today. So I'm just reinforcing those 2 points, but I agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Chris.
Hey guys.
Hi there. Hi, Chris's wife.
Thanks, Paul. That was really interesting. Hopefully, then you can send out the PowerPoints. I want to.
Yes, I will.
Some more. So, Paul, here's a quick question for you. So, it sounds like what you're saying essentially is like Romanticism and Enlightenment, or what's the other term you said? You said Enlightenment and basically, yeah, Romanticism and Enlightenment. Those two kind of philosophies are changing America, especially in this post-60s era. What about, so oftentimes in this discussion of how did we get here, people bring up communism. They'll bring up people like I think Antonio Gramsci and some of these other Italian communists who came to America in the 20s. What does that have do you think that also has a big impact in terms of where we are? Or is it mainly just those two other philosophies?
Yeah, no, actually it does. It just weaves into it. I actually, as I was developing this idea over the last 15 years, I kept asking myself, what's the link between economics? And I think it took me back to the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was this group in Germany that realized that Marx's view of communism wasn't quite working in the modern world. So they came up with revisions to it, and it's all built around the oppressed and oppressors, power struggles. And so we see the oppressed and the oppressors expressed in not only in economics, but in a lot of social structures. And so the Frankfurt School developed these ideas in terms of what the social critique ought to be. And in 1964, it was Mark Cusi who wrote the book One Dimensional Man, where he's growing out of this Frankfurt School. But fundamentally, I believe that if you run it to ground, they are embracing what is fun. I put them in the category of the spirit of Romanticism. In the lecture that I did last time, the second one, I had this graph, and it had the many faces of Romanticism, and it showed how Romanticism acts itself out in a lot of different kinds of behaviors. The Bohemians is one group, and you've got spiritual but not religious is another, and there's just all kinds of different ways, but they have a common root. And so I would argue that that this whole emotion that comes out of the Frankfurt School and this how it translates into politics has its origins in this basic spirit of Romanticism as a way of looking at the world.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Derry.
I just had a couple thoughts. Thank you, Paul. This was really, really good. I need to go back and watch the last two that you did. Super helpful and super timely. And I agree with you completely that things started to change in the 60s. I mean, I was pretty young then, but when the 80s rolled around and there was self-help bookstores all over the place, it's hard to deny that there was something happening in the culture then. And I bought into that, and I got very involved in New Age for years. So, and I see that continuing now and picking up even in our culture. And I'm glad that you talked about Michael Shermer. I was thinking about Sam Harris and his book, The Moral Landscape, and how he tries to ground morality in neuroscience and evolution. And, if he's going to go with evolution, things are not getting better. Clearly, all you have to do is look around. Evolution, just doesn't play out in that way. At least macroevolution doesn't, and society is not getting better. And I think that, human flourishing is the goal, right? For all of us. I mean, God wants us to flourish, but in a particular way, not in the way that Sam Harris and Michael Shermer want us to flourish. So I appreciated you talking about that. I also brought up that Romans 1 passage on my phone pretty early on in your talk, because it just screams, that's what's happening, that that's the real suppression of the truth. And, I think this is my view, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I think that knowledge of God's existence is a properly basic belief. I think that everyone has a knowledge of God's existence, and the suppression can be, really intense. And I think that it's a lot of what's happening in our culture now. But anyway, I appreciate everything that you said. And I think the only hope for our culture is for people to come to faith and trust in Christ. There's no other hope. That's it.
I think you'll enjoy the second of the two lectures last time, because I did spend a lot of time talking about New Age and how the culture changed. And I also talked about this notion of evolution. Edward O. Wilson is probably the advocate of that article in Atlantic called The Biological Basis of Morality. But there's a book that I pointed to that has looked at the history of trying to attach morals to evolution that goes all the way back to Darwin. And it's gone through ups and downs. People will say it and then it gets debunked, and then they'll say it again and then it gets debunked. So there's a lot out there on attempts to link morals to natural evolution, and what those studies show us is it just continues to fail.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, I wonder if you can comment, of how we would be able to apply this model then in our circles of influence as we are taking our walk in the neighborhood, or in our workplace and such. Do you have kind of an idea of like maybe what we should be thinking of, and where we should be able to
I think I tried to do that in the last slide. I struggle with that question too, Belinda. I wish I were a better apologist, because I get into conversations and I get stuck along the way with how to take it where I want it to go. But I think the notion of a Tao was very helpful to me, because it allowed me to make the claim that there's something out there that spiritually drives us in another direction. People can agree with that, and people can agree with the notion that we are all drawn to something spiritual. And if you can get the conversation on that common ground, then you can begin to talk about what spiritual answer makes the most sense, what spiritual answer is the most true to who we are, that gives us a center of love. We miss, I think, so often the most powerful apologetic, which is the prodigal son, the father standing at the window waiting for his son to come home. God wants his children back. And the notion that there's a God who loves us is just incredibly powerful. And also, I think the notion that the rights and wrongs exist. I tell people, we don't go into the prison to tell people they're guilty. They don't need to be told that. We go into the prison to tell them that there's a cure. And when they realize there's a cure, they break down. I mean, some of these guys will break down, they're just sobbing. It takes a couple of days to get them to the point that they're willing to do that in front of their colleagues. Let me just tell you that. But they do. And I mean, I was in one session where this one guy was saying, I haven't felt this way in 30 years. And there's 4 or 5 other inmates at the table watching him do this. And one of them sort of like feels like, I got to protect you. And so he says, hey, don't worry, whatever his name was, hey, we aren't going to say anything about this in the yard. And he put on his prison face all of a sudden. He looked up and he says, I don't care who you tell, kind of a thing. This is me. And if you don't like it, tough. But that veneer breaks down, and what breaks it down is this notion that they all have, that they need this healing, and that is just an incredibly powerful apologetic. So to go back to my summary, for me, it comes back to finding a common basis for a conversation, that there is a universal good out there, and that we do hunger for spirituality. And if you can get the conversation started at that point, in my opinion, you can begin to talk about what spiritual answers make the most sense.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll come to you too, Jim, in just a second. I would say, your point about like serving others. So as we in our conversations, just be able to remember, see the person that you're having a conversation with, who they are. They have the image of God in them, and then what is that, and recognize, that we have a common bond, that it is out there, that there is an objective truth there, and then to be able to ask questions and find out more about who this person is that is in front of us. Are they falling into the enlightenment, more the reasoning part, or are they more in the romanticism and feelings and emotion and me and such, or maybe they're a little bit of both. So,
Yeah, I had a conversation at dinner
yeah.
with this law professor from the famous guy. Actually, I play golf with him in the desert. So, well, I go to church on Sundays, but I go just because it makes me feel better. And I said, well, what meaning do you find in your life? Well, my meaning is that somehow I'm doing things for the posterity of future generations. And I think what I would do now, if I just kind of taught myself, is I would turn the conversation. Why do you think you have those feelings? Where do you think that comes from? We all have those feelings. Why do you think that's true? Animals don't have those feelings. We're different than all other animals. We're different. Why do you think that is?
That's a good approach. Thank you. Jim, did you have something to add?
I just was curious, Paul, in all your work over the last couple of years, have you detected some kind of result of what we call the Enlightenment, or this disenchantment from the Dark Ages? Has there been a similar effect on other religions and other cultures? Has there been, what's the word? Has there been an evolution, I guess, like this among Hindus or among Buddhists? Anything you might have seen there?
I would say that's a big question, and I'd want to give it a whole lot more thought before I tried to answer it. To be honest.
Well, maybe next time.
I can count on you for that, Jim.
You guys are heading down to, Jim's already down in Palmdale. I was going to say that when you drive down there, you guys could have that conversation, but
You can be sure we
when you
will.
go down
Yeah.
in December for your Kairos ministry. All right, we're at the bottom of the hour. It's 11:30. And I wanted to, honor everybody's time and Paul's time as well. So thank you, Paul. I wanted to let everybody know that this and his previous presentations are available at the RTB Portland chapter YouTube channel. And I can put that in the chat. Paul can also be reached at paul.rtb@aol.com. So you can email him and continue the conversation as well. Just a reminder about here, I need to put this in front of me. The reminder that Resonate 2023, Why the Christian Story Resonates with Humanity, is February 17th and 18th, 2023. And if you're interested in helping out or being part of the conversation, please just email me through the Portland chapter email. And okay, so I wanted to just thank you, our Portland chapter members and the guests from all around the world and nation that we came today. And also the guests who are watching at a future time. Thank you for joining us. And like I said, I want to honor your time. If anyone, including you, Paul, would like to stay and continue to chat, I'll keep the Zoom open. But if you need to scurry along and enjoy your day, the rest of your day, have a wonderful day, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us. All right. So, all right, Jim, do you have another comment? Go ahead.
I just had to notice that I'm watching out of the corner of my eye, Illinois and Michigan are playing,
Oh,
and Illinois is ahead in the third quarter. I want to pass that important life-changing information along.
do they fall on Romanticism or Enlightenment? And do they need a chest or?
It's just proof that God exists. That's all.
Cool.
Reason to believe.
Yes. Yeah. Ray, you look like you have a question. You look thoughtful.
Actually, I had a comment about your question about apologetics, and
Yes.
one idea I've used is okay. So there's this Enlightenment materialistic view. There's a lot of really, really smart people on that side that think the Romantics are idiots, and then on the Romantic side, there's a lot of really, really smart people think the Enlightenment people are idiots. So what's the truth have to be? The truth has to be is there's a little bit of truth on each side, but there's something unbalanced going on. There's some need for something to balance. And that's what that Paul brought up about the chess. That's what the chess does. It balances these different tensions and things going on in people. So talking about opposites, and that because of the smart people on each side, there has to be some truth on both sides, but there's something unbalanced going on. So what can balance it? So that's something that might be.
Yeah. So you put your finger on a lot of what I was trying to accomplish with what I called that three nodal framework, because what I wanted to say by that, and what I've tried to say when I write about it, is that we're not talking about one corner having the corner on all knowledge. There's something. There are really smart, intelligent people that occupy each space, and one of the things that I think we have a responsibility to do is to try to understand how they look at the world. And yes, you're right. There's a disconnect. So part of the purpose of this analysis that I've gone through is to try to identify what that disconnect is. And when it comes to Christianity versus the other two, the obvious disconnect is that we believe in a transcendent personal God, and that separates us from both. The question that has interested me is what separates this romantic and this Enlightenment view. And you're right, if you read Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, he just blows off the Romantics as just a bunch of idiots. They're just soft-headed, idiots. Daniel Dennett talks about he's got an expression for it, but it basically the dumbs, the brights. He says, if you believe in the Enlightenment, you're part of the brights, and implicitly anybody who isn't is part of the dumbs. Well, there's a reason that they believe that, but what do they miss? And so part of what I've tried to get at is what's the source of the imbalance, the point that you raised. And the source of the imbalance is, I believe that my analysis is that the Enlightenment folks reject any source of non-material reality. So they reject God, they reject a higher purpose. And when they do that, we devolve to becoming materialistic, mechanical people. And so you get into determinism, you get into no answer for consciousness, and they're smart people. So if you read Edward O. Wilson, if you even Einstein, they will say, even Harris and Sam Harris and the other guy that he debated on this, they'll all ultimately find themselves admitting that if you reject the notion of any non-material reality, you're stuck with determinism, which is alien to everything that we think. On the other hand, if you go to the other side and you say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to embrace these qualities that give us fullness of life, our emotion, the belly, if you will. The problem there is that if you say, I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to accept any objective external source of truth, you wind up with, there are no morals. And if you go back to the second of the two presentations that I made last summer, you find that in New Age, you find that in Joseph Campbell, you find that in so many of these spiritual but not religious worldviews, where they're forced into a corner of saying, there are no morals, there is no right or wrong. And we know that's not true. So they've worked themselves into believing in a worldview that isn't true to who we are. They're very smart people, and we know what got them there. But the trick, I think, and where I think the value of looking at culture from the perspective of these three different ways of looking at the world, is it forces you to ask the kind of question that you're asking right now. There are really intelligent people who are divided. What divides us? And as we begin to understand what divides us, I believe that draws us to Christianity as an answer.
The reason I believe Ian McGilchrist's work is helpful in this regard is both of those extremes you talked about are a manifestation of a person's thinking heavily left hemisphere oriented. The characteristics of the left hemisphere are the idea of grasping and controlling ideas, and once it gets hold of those ideas, it wants to stick with those ideas, unlike the right hemisphere, which actually views the world much differently, a more holistic kind of view. So he describes both of those pathologies in terms of left hemisphere dominance. It's a very helpful framework for thinking about what becomes unbalanced, even in very, very smart people. There's another author that deals with that, Gazanigan, Michael, I think it's Michael Gazanigan, also deals with that. Yeah, the left hemisphere is orientation is the culprit in all this. And what McGilchrist is saying, we need to, and by the way, everybody uses both hemispheres. So it's not that we don't have the capability, it's just there's a preference. And once you get locked into the preference, it's
Well,
like
I would actually argue that we both use them, but we can't use both of them with a coherent worldview without acknowledging something external to ourselves. And so when we do, without acknowledging that, we're living with a cognitive dissonance. We're living with it as if it's real, but we don't have a coherent worldview to explain it. I'm sure that Ian McGilchrist gives you a far more sophisticated view of Myers-Briggs. But Myers-Briggs, if you're in management, you study these things, and it talks about thinkers and feelers. And as a manager, you have to sort of look at your employees and individuals and begin to understand some are thinkers and some are feelers, and both have something to contribute. But that is, I think, in a very crude way, the left brain, right brain thing that you're talking about.
Just to kind of step into that conversation, the left brain and the right brain, they're attached to each other. They have the very thick corpus callosum, if I'm remembering my anatomy correctly.
I knew the doctor would come in here someplace.
And so therefore, they're connected. But I think culturally, as we enter into education, or even, even as toddlers and such, the culture, we tend to divide, ourselves, like, oh, this person's a intellectual and this person's, creative. When in actuality, we're a whole being, and we have both the creativity and artistic abilities as well as our intellect, and they shouldn't be divided. And when we, and I guess that's kind of where the chest comes in again, and the Tao, why are we not divided? Because we're created as a whole being for both of those. And we need to integrate both of those together to be whole. And that's kind of what I think, and that it's a artificial when we decide, oh, we're just left brain, right brain, or thinker or feeler, when in actuality we're
We're
both.
both. Sure, absolutely.
Exactly.
Any other thoughts? This is a great conversation. Gary, you look like you have a thought to me too. Mary also, go ahead and chime in. Mary, did you want to say something? I see your mute is off.
Well, I actually have more questions than answers. It's I just don't know how to express it, and it may be off topic. That's why I didn't want to take up everybody's time. But I'm just thinking, I believe myself to be an Orthodox Christian, and we're debating where all these moral values come from. And if we really believe in what we believe, it should all come from one source, and that is the triune God, right? And so, where do you think the Tao came from? It must be also from this
So-
God that we believe in, right?
Yeah,
And
so go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think the pathway, this is how I've processed it. I think the pathway is, you're right, the source is God, the source is Jesus Christ, the source is the morals that come from God. And God created us in his image. And as a result of that, we have that embedded in us. And we have it embedded in us whether we acknowledge it or not. It's there. And we may not know that that's why it's there, but it's there. And so what I think C.S. Lewis has done with the Tao, if you will, is he's made the empirical observation that if you look at the way humans have behaved over the last several thousand years and decades and millennium, is that we've behaved in a way that demonstrates empirically that something is there. And so then it becomes a question of understanding where it came from. And I think the biblical answer is it came because of the way we were created. And that's where the image of God becomes so important. We were created in the image of God. We can't not be created in the image of God. So I may decide I don't believe in God. I may be Sam Harris, but I'm still created in the image of God. And that's who I am. And I can't not be who I am.
So one question I have about this is, why did C.S. Lewis had to use the Tao to come to eventually to the conclusion about the agape way? So
Yeah.
why was he shy about using the Bible to explain the origin of all these moral values? That's one thing. And then another thing was, while I was listening to all this, I recalled something that happened to me, and that was a few years ago. I was introduced to the idea that actually, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, that China, the Chinese, they actually knew this triune God. And that is, I think that is where the Tao came from. It really was loosely based on history, that they knew about all these things. But the thing that I found out about this Chinese history was so fantastic. It's almost like a conspiracy. And so it was very interesting, but after a while I was distracted and I didn't follow up. But it's amazingly interesting in that if you know the Chinese characters, the story of creation and salvation were actually embedded in some of these Chinese characters that we have, if you take those Chinese characters apart, there is a story of creation, there is a story of salvation, and the Lamb of God. Because, for example, the word sacrifice was made up of the lamb, part of it, maybe call it a radical or something like that. It's made up of the lamb, and then there's the word of sacrifice.
Hmm.
So that was very, very fascinating. And so it brought me back today to think that there must be some truth in this, that once upon a time, China actually knew the triune God.
Yeah. Well, I think that
Because there are a lot of words.
Oh, Mary, you're kind
Yes.
of breaking up a bit. Do you want to just go ahead and stop your video, but continue talking? And I think we might
Sure.
hear you better. And then from what I understand, if I can summarize what you said, you had the question of why did C.S. Lewis use the Tao versus just going straight to biblical source. And then you're mentioning how the Tao or the Tao is a Chinese character, which is interesting, and that there was also the triune God in some of the Chinese characters, as well as the idea of salvation. Is that correct? And then maybe we can let Paul answer.
Yeah, that is because even in their worship, for example, like what do you call those burning those incense that they burn, and it's always 3 sticks.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
That's
Interesting.
Which or the Father and the Holy. That's why it was just so fascinating, and I don't know why this idea hasn't, been more well known, and it's just amazing.
Maybe it'll make it into Paul's book.
Um,
I think it might make it into Paul's book. Let him respond to your question first, Mary.
Yeah, I think I
can forward to you.
I think I can respond to the first part. And Michael Ward talks about this. The sense is that C.S. Lewis was trying to reach a wider audience. And if he went right to Christianity, there are some people who would stop listening. And I think he felt that there was a general thought that he could bring into the conversation about the importance of moral standards that are universal by using the Tao as his way of describing it. And that by doing that, he would get other people to listen. And it worked because he got his book is highly acclaimed by Christian and non-Christian thinkers. I think it was Doug Kell that raised the point that there might not be an exact coherence between the Tao and its history and the way C.S. Lewis used it. But I think it's clear how he did use it and how he tried to use it. I do think that there's a real, and I'm not sure if I'm getting the grasp of your question correctly here, but I do think that there's a real history of cultures having tried to struggle with our source of humanity, creation, and Hugh Ross talks a lot about that. He makes the argument, for example, that among all of these legends of creation, the Christian story in Genesis is the only one that really matches up with what science and astrology would tell us. But it raises the question, where did all these stories come from? And the way Hugh Ross tries to answer that is to simply say, we have a common human memory. We may have originated in Adam and Eve, and as the generations passed on and stories began to be told from one generation to another, they might take on different kinds of views. And so what you're seeing is a common cultural sense that there is a story to be told about our origins. but a lot of variety in how that story takes place. And the significance of that, as Hugh Ross would argue, is that it's that we have those common narratives because there's a truth to the idea that we were created and we have an origin, and B, there's a lot of variety because as it got passed down through generations, it got very distorted. And I don't know if that's an answer to your question or not, but that's at least how I processed what I think you were trying to say.
That's probably true too. But once upon a time, really, everybody knew about this triune God, and so I find that very, very interesting, especially when you analyze the Chinese characters. If you know it, it's made up of a lot of meanings. And I do have one other point. It's changing the subject a bit. And when you people were arguing about can you hear me?
There's a lot of
Can you hear
static,
me
Mary.
properly?
There's a lot of static.
Okay.
Can I make a comment,
This
real quick,
thing
Mary, before you
about
move
the
on to it? Oh, Mary, can I make a comment before you move on to the your next topic? It kind of addresses
Yes.
your question. Here's the book, The Abolition of Man that I had to read for Reasons Institute course, evangelism in a scientific context, and we had to read The Abolition of Man. Man, that was really very hard. But Paul did a great job today. But it has an appendix, and it says illustrations of the Tao, where he has like different quotes, like from an ancient Egyptian, ancient Jewish, ancient Chinese, Old Norse. So I felt that as I looked at that appendix and going through it, that really did broaden the reach of the Tao and strengthen the argument that this is an objective moral standard, that there is an objective standard that spanned not only time but different cultures, and by doing so, that I think increase or made it more solid, his argument, and then that brings it to like, okay, well, why is that? Where does that come from? And that's kind of where we come in, that we share the Christian story about where that moral standard originates. That's kind of
Right.
my thought, and I think that's what Paul's saying. Ray, you wanted to comment on that too?
I would just say, let me thank you for doing that, because I think that really is the answer. And I think you brought us back to how C.S. Lewis was really interpreting the Tao, and that appendix really tells us that story. So thank you for pointing that out, Belinda.
You're welcome.
Mhm.
Ray?
One point that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and some of the other inklings talk about quite a bit, and it was actually part of what actually converted C.S. Lewis from an atheist to a Christian, is the idea that we get in touch with the spiritual through our imaginations, and that the ancient myths have elements of truth because ancient thinkers would get a glimpse of the spiritual reality. And so one of the things that, as I say, led to C.S. Lewis's conversion is the commonality about the myths from various cultures. And the net result was he ended up concluding that the difference between Christianity and the ancient myths is Christianity is the true myth. It's the one that is the total truth. And the other ones were just glimpses and have elements of that truth. And so that may partially relate to what Mary was talking about, ancient Chinese thinkers. So.
Right.
Okay, Mary, what was the next one that you
The
wanted to
next
bring up?
was, can you hear me now
Yes,
properly?
I hope so. Yeah.
You guys were talking about kind of like why Enlightenment or why Romanticism. For myself, I really feel with a totally non-scientific background, and the one reason why I'm attracted to Reason to Believe was using science and using the scientific method kind of. And I really think it is very, very important to make Christians believable when they are doing evangelizing, because the scientific method is a very, very good way to really understand the feelings and everything. You know, I think it helped me a lot, and that's why I'm attracted to attending RTB things. Although most of the time, you know, I didn't understand some of the things that are being talked about. But and that is my feeling about why Christianity has got such a bad reputation, because I know a lot of very committed Christians, they don't use the scientific method. And so when they try to spread the gospel or whatever, it came out as being superstition because of the way they present it. And that is part of the reason why after a while, I've also become a bit anti-Christian myself, even though I know that I have the truth. And so I think there's the reason why all these things happen in history, where you have the Enlightenment, and then eventually there's the Romanticism. It's just like going from one extreme to another, and both have their good and the bad. And so this is how I believe.
So Mary, let me
why
just,
RTB, very, yes?
I was
Okay.
gonna say, let me validate that to this extent. I think one of the things we have to be on guard against is letting Christians destroy our Christianity. And I think there are Christians who look down their nose at you know, doing these scientific comparisons. You know, it's analysis by paralysis. You don't come to Christianity through your head, you come to Christianity through your heart. I've been lectured all of those things. You know, and it's because they want to see it as either or, and it's not either or. We come to God through our heart and through our head, and we come to God as whole people. And so we come to God both because it makes sense, but because we submit our heart. And if you try to make it one or the other, you have an incomplete view. And we can't allow the fact that many Christians try to make it all in the head or all in the heart, because that's where they are. We can't allow that to let that sort of take us in the wrong direction. We have to know who we are.
Yes, I feel exactly the same way. But I am like a voice in the wilderness, because I know when I kind of bring things up in my own church, and I love my church, they are really, really very good, true believers. I kind of hesitate to voice too much of my opinions, because they accuse me of, going down the rabbit hole again. So I try to keep quiet.
Well, Mary, I think
I don't
Not
think
to come here.
I was going to say, I just don't think there's a problem keeping quiet.
Sorry?
I don't think there's a problem keeping quiet. I mean, I'll go to church and I'll see, I'm around young earth Christians, and my attitude is, if that's works for you, you know, go for it. got into a conversation with this, when we go to the prison, we've got all kinds of Christians. So one of them was a Young Earth guy, and we're off during a break, and we're having a conversation. And he starts talking Young Earth, I start talking Old Earth, and he paused about 2 minutes into the conversation. He looked at me and says, "Is this a salvation issue?" And I said, "No." He said, "Good." We hugged each other and that was it. And we just didn't go any farther with it. You don't need to go down these rabbit holes.
Yeah, and I think
know.
the other part, by the way, Mary, you can turn your video back on because it doesn't seem to matter on your on that.
Okay.
So what was I thinking? Oh yeah. This balance between your intellect and your feelings and such is that it's important to acknowledge that they're there, right? And we can use that. I can't remember actually. I got thrown off. I'm having one of Dennis's, what do you call them? A brain, disconnect all of a sudden. Go ahead. Anyways, if I think of it, I'll mention it again.
Well,
I wanted to add, Mary?
really appreciate. Yeah.
We're probably going to go pretty soon, but
Are
is
you still there?
there anything else that you wanted to add?
Actually, there's a football game.
This
I
is the
wanna go
last
to.
thing I'm
Oh,
going to
okay.
say. Oh, okay. I
short, Mary.
really still want to go. I still want to go back to my church because there are people there who would phone me up and say, "Mary, please don't change." And so, there are people who love me and there are people who may not be like that, but I just feel I need to be authentic. I'm not going to agree with some of the things they say, but I've learned to keep quiet and just let it go. And like Paul, it really is not a problem, even if we disagree between New Earth or Old Earth.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Hey,
I
did
really
you have
appreciate
wanted
that,
to
and
add
I
something?
look forward to.
Okay, sorry.
I'm really looking forward more to Paul's presentation in the future.
I think he's going to be going
That's
to
all I have to say.
for BC RTP chapter, probably in January or February. Ray, it looks like you wanted to say,
I just was wondering if Mary leaned closer to her microphone, it might help the clarity. 'Cause
okay.
I thought I detected more clarity when she was up close.
Okay. Thanks, Ray.
Yeah, I know my iPad and my speaker is very old. I need to upgrade.
Oh, it does. It is
But,
much better when you're.
Yeah, thank you. It was
Okay. I think
Being-
that I wanted
okay.
to just maybe end with before Paul is about like this Resonate conference, or actually this Resonate 2023 event. And just that this that our artistic and creative, we can reach people through that. God reaches us through that as well as our intellect and our reasoning. But as Paul has pointed out, that we can't just get to the place of the existence of God and of Christianity from one end or the other. We have to do it in the middle and going anchored and pointing upward. So even as Christians, strong believers and such, we kind of consistently need to go back to that and remember, that we are a whole person, and that we need to look at the other person that is in our circle of influence that we're having a conversation with and serve them, identify who they are, and then direct our questions and our curiosity towards them, not necessarily where we're starting from.
Yeah, let me just close, I think, with this thought, and it relates to the comment that Ray made about intelligent people on all sides. Charles Taylor has this concept of finding a Jamesian space. He draws it from William James. And the thought is that we close ourselves off from other ways of looking at the world. And if we want to really open ourselves to other ways of looking at the world, we have to go far enough into it to feel the crosswinds, to feel the pressures that drive one in that toward those other worldviews, and to acknowledge that none of us can claim to have a corner of certainty. We all take leaps of faith. We as Christians take leaps of faith. The scientists take leaps of faith. The romantic people take leaps of faith. We all take leaps of faith, which suggests to us that we have to be willing to be respectful of people who have opted to other worldviews. Doesn't mean that we have to compromise on what we believe, nor does it even mean that we have to soften our evangelical zeal, if you will. But it gives us a way to think about moving into this cultural space in a way that is respectful and in a way that is appreciating how other people come to their views in a way that allows us to say, yes, I really do understand how you could get to that point. Now let's talk.
Beautiful.
That's a
beautiful,
great, yeah, go ahead. Ray. Yeah, I think it's beautiful too. Thank you, Ray. And thank you, Paul, once again, and Mary and Dennis. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And Paul, thank you so much. I know that you put so much time and effort, and caused a little bit of anxiety for you to push you to do this.
Yeah, no, let me say,
presentation for
Belinda,
us.
two things. First of all, I want to thank you for, kind of encouraging me through this, but also, if I sit off in my office and I do all this stuff, my family tells me there's Paul off in his office, my masterminding. So what you've done for me is you've given me a platform to talk to other people about what I'm thinking about. So that's been a blessing to me.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that RTB Portland chapter can do that.
Yeah, Paul, I just wanted to thank you so much. It was very delicious and it just intellectually satisfying. And I will listen to your other the other two lectures. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Well, I will go ahead and hang on for a little bit longer if anybody else wants to stay, but Paul, and go ahead and watch your football game.
See you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, everyone. I go too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.